The colony of Ashmark was not a beautiful place. It sat at the far edge of known space, where the sky was always a dull orange and the wind carried fine gray dust that settled on everything. The buildings were low and made of dark stone. The streets were narrow and uneven. It was the kind of place people came to when they had no better option, and stayed because leaving was harder than it looked. Different species lived in Ashmark together. Not always happily but always practically. There were the tall insect-like Vethkins who ran the medical post. There were the broad gray-orange traders who kept the marketplace moving. There were a small number of humans scattered here and there, mostly workers and wanderers who had ended up at the edge of space the way dust ends up in corners. And then there were the dragons. The dragons were the proudest people in Ashmark. They had been in this part of space long before most other species arrived, and they carried themselves like they knew it. They were large, strong, and deeply traditional. They did not ask for help. They did not show pain in public. They did not bend. Ryvan had never fit among them. He was 12 years old by dragon counting, which made him roughly the age of a young teenager by human measure. But where other dragon boys his age were already broad and strong, Ryvan was thin. His scales were a dull greenish-gray instead of the rich deep green that his family carried. His wings were small and uneven, the left one slightly shorter than the right, which meant he could not fly properly yet. The other young dragons had noticed all of this a long time ago. They called him Hollow Bones. They called him Ashwing. They said he looked more like a lizard than a dragon. Ryvan had learned to ignore most of it. He could ignore it because he had Kale. Kale was his older brother by 4 years and everything about him was the opposite of Ryvan. He was tall and broad-shouldered. His scales were a deep, rich green that caught the light well. He was fast and strong and well-respected among the young dragons of Ashmark. More than once he had stepped in front of someone twice Ryvan's size and told them, quietly and without raising his voice, to walk away. And they had walked away. Kale never made Ryvan feel small. He never looked at his brother's thin wings or dull scales with disappointment. When Ryvan struggled to keep up on walks, Kale slowed down without commenting on it. When Ryvan was left out of games, Kale left with him. He was not just a brother. He was the reason Ryvan felt safe in a place that did not always feel safe. Which was why the morning everything changed was the worst morning of Ryvan's life. They had gone to the marketplace together the way they did most mornings. Kale was carrying a bundle of trade goods for their grandfather. Ryvan walked beside him, watching the stalls and listening to Kale talk about something he had heard from one of the orange traders the day before. It was an ordinary morning. The dust was blowing lightly. The orange sky was bright. Then Kale stopped talking. Ryvan looked up at him. Kale had gone very still. The color in his scales had changed, shifting from deep green to something paler, like the green had been washed out of them suddenly. His breathing changed too. It became shallow and uneven, the kind of breathing that sounds like effort instead of something natural. Ryvan said his name. Kale turned to look at him, and there was something in his eyes that Ryvan had never seen there before. Something that looked like confusion and fear mixed together. Kale opened his mouth to say something. Then he collapsed. He went down hard, his full weight hitting the stone ground of the marketplace with a sound that made every nearby head turn. The bundle of trade goods scattered. A Vethkin woman nearby jumped back with a sharp sound of alarm. Within seconds there was a small crowd forming, pressing in from all sides, looking down at the large dragon boy lying still on the ground. Ryvan dropped to his knees beside his brother. Kale was breathing. But it was wrong. Every breath sounded labored, like something was pressing down on his chest from inside. His scales had gone almost gray now, the color draining further by the minute. His eyes were open but not fully focused. Ryvan grabbed his brother's arm and said his name again and again. Kale blinked slowly but did not respond properly. The colony medical team arrived within minutes. 2 Vethkin healers with their equipment, and the senior healer, a large Vethkin officer named Soren who had run the medical post in Ashmark for many years. They moved the crowd back and ran their instruments over Kale quickly and efficiently. Ryvan stood back and watched and tried to stay calm. Soren looked at the readings for a long moment. Then he looked at his assistant. Then he looked at Kale again. He ran the instruments a second time. When he straightened up, his expression was the kind that doctors carry when the news is the worst kind. He said the words clearly and without trying to soften them. Ashvale sickness. Ryvan knew the name. Most people in this part of space knew it. Ashvale was a rare internal condition where a particular type of crystal structure began forming inside the body, spreading slowly through the organs, hardening them from the inside. In its early stages it was treatable. In its middle stages it was difficult but possible. In its advanced stage, the stage that Soren was describing, it was considered beyond treatment. The crystals had already reached Kale's secondary organs. Soren said it plainly. There was nothing to be done. The spread was too far along. Any treatment at this stage would only accelerate the process. The kindest thing now was to keep him comfortable. Riven stared at him. He heard the words. He understood what each word meant individually. But his mind refused to put them together into the thing they were trying to tell him. He looked down at his brother on the ground. Kale's eyes had closed now. His chest was still moving but the breaths were getting slower. Riven looked back up at Soren and said there had to be something. Soren looked at him with something close to pity and said there was not. Then he began giving quiet instructions to his assistant about moving Kale somewhere more comfortable. Riven stepped back. Then he turned and walked away from the crowd. Then he ran. He ran through the marketplace, past stalls and carts and startled traders. He ran down the narrow streets of Ashmark with no clear direction, only the desperate and unreasonable idea that if he could just find anyone who had not already given up, then it would not be over yet. He went to the 3 other healers in the colony. Each of them listened. Each of them asked a few questions. Each of them shook their head. One of them was genuinely sorry. One of them was impatient. All of them said the same thing. Ashvale in this stage was not survivable. There was no known treatment. He should go and be with his brother. Riven kept running. He did not know what he was looking for anymore. He only knew that stopping felt like agreeing and he was not ready to agree. He turned a corner near the eastern edge of the colony, the quieter part where the buildings were older and the streets were more worn, and he nearly ran into a pair of boots. He stopped and looked up. An old human woman was sitting on a low bench outside a small dwelling. She was not remarkable to look at. Short gray hair. A plain worn jacket. Hands that moved steadily over a metal instrument she was cleaning with a cloth. She was not young. She was not large. She looked like someone who had lived a long and tiring life and had ended up here at the edge of space the same way most people did, without entirely planning it. Her name was Edna. She looked up at Riven when he stopped in front of her. She looked at his face, at the way he was breathing hard from running, at the expression he was wearing that no child should have to wear. She did not say anything yet. She just looked at him steadily and waited. Riven reached out with both hands and grabbed the edge of her sleeve with his small claws. He felt his voice cracking before he even started speaking. He tried to hold it together. He managed barely. "Please," he said. "Please save my brother." Edna looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were calm and dark and very direct. She did not look away from him. She did not look uncomfortable the way adults sometimes did when a child was about to cry. She simply looked at him, and something in that steady gaze felt like the first solid ground Riven had found since Kale hit the marketplace floor. She set down her cloth. She set down the instrument. She picked up the worn kit beside her bench and stood up. She said, "Take me to him." And she meant it. Riven led Edna through the colony streets at a pace that was almost running. Edna kept up without complaint. She had a long steady stride for someone her age, the kind that came from years of moving quickly through difficult places without wasting energy on panic. She carried her kit under one arm and said nothing as they moved. She did not ask questions. She did not slow down to look at things. She simply followed the small dragon boy through the narrow streets of Ashmark and kept her eyes forward. Riven glanced back at her once to check she was still there. She was. He faced forward again and kept moving. The building they arrived at was one of the larger stone structures near the center of the colony. It belonged to Drazen, Riven and Kale's grandfather, and it was the kind of building that reflected the dragon who lived in it. Heavy. Built to last and built to impress. The stone walls were thick and the doorway was tall enough for a fully grown dragon to pass through without lowering their head. There were already people gathered outside it. Word had moved through Ashmark the way word always moved through small colonies, quickly and without anyone meaning to spread it. Several dragons stood near the entrance in small quiet groups, speaking in low voices. A few Oran traders had stopped nearby to watch. 2 Vethkan assistants from the medical post stood off to one side with their equipment at their feet, clearly waiting to be told what to do next. Riven pushed through without stopping and Edna followed him inside. The main room was large and dim and smelled of old stone and something medicinal that the Vethkan healers had already been using. Kale lay on a wide stone platform in the center of the room. Someone had placed a folded covering under his head. His eyes were closed now. His scales were the color of ash, almost no green left in them at all. His chest rose and fell but the movement was small and effortful, like each breath was a decision his body had to make carefully. Standing around the room were the people who mattered in Ashmark, at least the people who thought they mattered. Drazen stood at the head of the platform. He was the largest dragon Riven had ever seen, and that included dragons he had met at colony gatherings who were considered large even by their own standards. Drazen was old, with deep scars crossing his scales from a life that had not been gentle, and eyes the color of dark amber that missed very little. He had been the head of their family for longer than most people in Ashmark had been alive. He was not a cruel dragon, but he was a proud one, and pride in someone that large and that old had a weight to it that most beings in the room had learned not to push against. Soren stood nearby, the senior Vethkin healer who had made the diagnosis in the marketplace. He was tall and angular in the way Vethkins were, with pale grayish skin and long fingers that he kept folded together when he was not using them. He had the careful, composed expression of someone who considered themselves the authority in the room and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Several dragon elders stood along the walls. Older relatives, community figures, beings who had come because Drazen's family was involved and their presence was expected. They stood straight and still and watched everything with the particular expression of people waiting for something to end. Nobody in the room looked like they expected anything good to happen. Riven walked to the center of the room and Edna walked in behind him. The change in the room was immediate. Not loud. Not dramatic. But immediate. Heads turned. Eyes moved from Riven to the old human woman behind him and stayed there. The silence shifted from the heavy kind to the uncomfortable kind. Edna did not react to any of it. She looked at Kale first, directly and with focus, the way a person looks at a problem they are already beginning to think through. Then she looked at the room calmly. Soren spoke first. He asked, in a tone that was technically polite and actually not, what exactly the human woman thought she was doing here. Edna told him she was here to help the patient. Soren looked at her for a moment the way someone looks at something they cannot decide whether to find irritating or amusing. Then he made a short, clipped sound that the Vethkins used when something struck them as either foolish or funny, and in this case it was clearly both. He told her that the case had already been fully assessed by qualified medical professionals and the outcome was determined. He told her that her presence was unnecessary and, frankly, inappropriate. He said the word human the way some beings said it in this part of space. Not as a description. As a reduction. Drazen had not spoken yet. He stood at the head of the platform and watched Edna with those dark amber eyes and said nothing. But his silence had a direction to it. It was pointed at her like something with an edge. When he finally spoke his voice was low and even and left very little room for argument. He told her to leave. He said it without drama. He did not shout. He did not need to. He simply said it the way someone says a thing that they consider already settled, already decided, already done. He said that his grandson would not be touched by a human. He said it was a matter of dignity. He said the family had enough to bear without adding this to it. He nodded toward the door. The room waited. Edna stood where she was. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. But she did not move toward the door either. She simply stood in the middle of that large dim room with her kit under her arm and looked at Drazen with an expression that was not challenging exactly, but was not retreating either. It was the expression of someone who had stood in difficult rooms before and had not found the experience as frightening as other people seemed to expect. One of the dragon elders along the wall made a low sound of disapproval. Soren said again that she should go. Another voice from somewhere in the room agreed. The pressure in the space was building the way pressure does when a group of people who are used to being obeyed encounter someone who is not obeying. And then something happened that nobody in the room expected. Riven walked to the center of the floor and stood between Edna and his grandfather. He was small. He was visibly shaking. His thin wings were pressed flat against his back and his hands were tight at his sides. He was a frail dragon boy who had been overlooked and dismissed his entire life by most of the people currently standing in this room. He had no authority. He had no standing. He had nothing except the fact that he was standing there and was not moving. He looked up at his grandfather. Then he looked around the room at the healers and the elders and the waiting faces. When he spoke his voice was not loud but it was clear. He said that Kale was dying. He said that every person in this room had looked at his brother and turned away. He said the healers had given up and the elders had accepted it and everyone was already standing the way people stand at an ending. Then he said the thing that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. He said, "You are all giving up." She is not. Nobody spoke. Drazen looked down at his grandson. The amber eyes moved over Riven's small shaking frame and thin pressed wings and the expression on his young face that was frightened and certain at the same time. Drazen had known this child his entire life. He had looked at Riven most of that time with a kind of resigned disappointment, the quiet grief of a proud dragon whose grandson had not grown into the shape expected of him. But what was standing in front of him now was not the child he had catalogued and set aside. Something moved behind those amber eyes. Something that did not have a simple name. The room was completely silent. Drazen looked at Riven for a long moment. Then he looked at Edna. Then he looked at his grandson one more time. A long, slow look that carried a great deal of weight in a very short time. Then he stepped back from the platform. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply stepped back and in doing so opened the space beside Kale that he had been occupying. He told Edna she had one chance. His voice was flat and quiet. He told her that if Kale died while under her hands, she would be gone from Ashmark before the sun was down. Edna looked at him steadily. Then she nodded once. She set her kit down beside the platform, opened it with the calm and practiced movements of someone who had done this in far worse places than this, and looked down at Kale with focused and careful eyes. Then she got to work. The first thing Edna did was nothing. She stood beside the platform and looked at Kale for a long moment without touching him and without opening her kit. She looked at his scales, at the gray that had spread across them. She looked at the rise and fall of his chest. She looked at the color of the thin membrane on his wings and the way his claws were curled slightly inward. She took in everything slowly and carefully, the way someone reads something important before deciding what to write back. The room watched her do this and said nothing. But the silence had an edge to it. The kind of silence that is really impatience wearing a quiet face. Soren, the Vethkan healer, stood with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral. He had already decided what he thought of this. He was simply waiting for it to play out so he could say he had been right. The dragon elders along the walls were still and unreadable. Drazen had moved to the far side of the room and stood with his back straight and his eyes on Edna and his face showing nothing at all. Riven stood close to the platform and watched Edna with the focused and desperate attention of someone who has run out of every option except this one. After a long quiet minute, Edna reached into her kit and pulled out a small flat reader, an old model, the kind that had been standard medical equipment maybe 15 years ago and had since been replaced by newer technology everywhere except in the hands of people who worked in places too far from the center of things to afford upgrades. She ran it slowly over Kale's chest and side and then looked at the readings for a while. Then she looked at Soren. She asked him to walk her through exactly what treatments had already been applied. Soren's expression shifted slightly. He had not expected to be asked for information. He had expected to be ignored or argued with, or to watch the human woman do something visibly inadequate that he could then point to. Being asked a direct professional question was not what he had prepared for. He answered anyway. He listed the treatments in order. High-frequency energy pulse to the chest cavity to disrupt crystal formation. Thermal shock compound applied to the upper and lower back to slow the spread. A cellular accelerant administered to try to speed up the body's own resistance. Edna listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him, in the same plain and even tone, to look at the rate of crystal spread over the time those treatments had been applied and tell her what direction the rate had moved. Soren looked at her. She waited. He looked down at his own equipment reluctantly. He pulled up the recorded data. He looked at it for a moment. A small shift happened in his expression, something that was not quite comfortable. The rate had increased. Every time a treatment was applied, the spread had accelerated. Not by a small amount. Edna said it out loud, not to embarrass him, simply because it needed to be said clearly. She told the room that Ashvale crystals were not like most internal threats. They did not respond to force the way other conditions did. High energy, thermal shock, cellular accelerants, all of these created the exact conditions that Ashvale fed on. Every aggressive treatment the healers had applied had not been fighting the sickness. It had been feeding it. The room was very quiet. One of the dragon elders made a low sound. Soren's folded arms tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Drazen looked at Edna from across the room with an expression that had shifted from blank to something more attentive, though his face still gave very little away. Edna did not wait for a response. She turned back to Kale and began. The first thing she did was go through the medical record and effectively undo what had been done. She administered a neutralizing compound from her kit, a simple mixture, the kind of thing that looked almost embarrassingly basic compared to what the Vethkan healers carried. It was designed not to fight the crystals but to calm the environment around them, to stop giving them something to react to. Soren said from behind her that what she was using was outdated. That the compounds in her kit were an older generation of treatment that current medical understanding had moved past. Edna said, without turning around, that current medical understanding had been accelerating the spread for the past 4 hours, so she was going to try something different. Nobody argued with that. She worked steadily. She applied the neutralizing compound in careful, measured amounts, not flooding Kale's system with it but introducing it gradually, giving his body time to receive it without shock. She monitored his breathing between each step. She checked his scale temperature with a small handheld sensor and made small adjustments based on what she found. Then she began the second part. She explained it as she worked, not loudly, not as a lecture, just clearly enough for anyone listening to follow. She called it mineral flushing. A slow introduction of specific mineral compounds that, when combined correctly, would begin to weaken the crystalline structures from the inside. Not break them apart suddenly. Not blast them. Simply make them brittle over time, the way water over years makes stone soft. The key was temperature. The compounds only worked within a very specific temperature range. Too warm and they dissolved before reaching the crystals. Too cool and they moved too slowly to be effective. She had to keep Kale's internal temperature steady within a range so narrow that most beings would not have considered it manageable without precise modern equipment. Edna did it with a small thermal pad, a manual sensor, and 30 years of understanding exactly how bodies worked when they were struggling. Soren watched her for a while. Then he said, with the kind of professional politeness that is not really polite at all, that her approach was interesting but extremely slow. That even if it was working, which he doubted, Kale's condition might deteriorate faster than the treatment could keep up with. Edna nodded and said he might be right. Then she kept working. What nobody had commented on yet, but everyone in the room had noticed, was that Edna was talking. Not to anyone in the room. Not to Soren or Riven or Drazen or any of the watching elders. She was talking to Kale. Quietly, steadily, in the same even tone she used for everything. She talked as she worked, her hands moving carefully over his scales while her voice ran alongside those movements like something parallel. She said simple things. She told him what she was doing. She told him his color was already slightly better in the upper chest, which was true, the faintest hint of green returning. She told him his brother was right there and had not left and was not going to leave. She told him to keep breathing. Just keep breathing. One at a time. She had him. One of the dragon elders near the wall made a quiet sound that was not quite a laugh but was in that direction. A sound that meant this was strange and slightly absurd. Riven, who had been watching Edna's hands and watching Kale's face and trying to read every small change in both, looked at Edna for a moment. He had been wanting to ask since she started. He kept stopping himself because he did not want to interrupt something that seemed to matter even if he did not fully understand why. Finally he asked. He asked her why she kept talking to Kale when Kale could not hear her. Edna did not stop what she was doing. Her hands continued their careful movement and her eyes stayed on her work. But she answered him clearly and without any pause as though she had been expecting the question and already knew exactly what she wanted to say. She said, because the body heals faster when it knows someone is still fighting for it. Riven looked at her. Then he looked at his brother. He thought about that answer for a long time without saying anything else. After a while he pulled a low stool from the corner of the room and set it beside the platform close to where Edna was working. He sat down on it and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at Kale's face. And then, quietly and a little awkwardly, as though he was not entirely sure how to do it but was going to try anyway, Riven started talking to his brother too. He said small things. He said he was there. He said he was not going anywhere. He said that Edna was helping and that she was good, he could tell she was good, and that Kale needed to hold on a little longer. Edna heard him. She did not comment on it. But something in her expression settled slightly, the way a person looks when something is going exactly as it should. She kept working. The night was just beginning. The colony outside went quiet the way small places do late at night. The market sounds faded. The traders went home. The wind dropped to almost nothing and the gray dust settled. Ashmark became still and dark except for the low lights burning in the windows of the buildings and the stars above, thin and far away in the orange-black sky. Inside the room nothing was still. Edna worked without stopping. Her hands moved carefully and slowly over Kale, checking temperature, adjusting the mineral compound amounts, monitoring the readings on her old flat sensor. The movements looked small from a distance. Quiet. Almost gentle. But each one was deliberate and each one mattered and she did not waste a single one. The room had changed since the early evening. Most of the dragon elders had gone. Not because they had stopped caring or at least not only because of that, but because standing in a room watching something slow happen is difficult to sustain for hours, and pride makes it harder to sustain. Drazen had not gone. He sat now in a large chair against the far wall, his great scaled arms resting on his knees, his amber eyes open and fixed on Kale. He had not spoken in a long time. He had not slept either. Soren was still there. He sat on a bench near the doorway with his equipment on the floor beside him. He had stopped making comments an hour ago. He watched Edna work with an expression that had slowly, over the course of the night, moved from dismissive to something more complicated. He did not say what he was thinking. But he was thinking it. Riven had not moved from his stool. He had talked to Kale for a while the way Edna did, quiet and steady. After a time the words ran out and he simply sat close and watched his brother's face and listened to his breathing and counted the breaths without meaning to, because counting them was the only way to keep track of the thing he most needed to know, which was that they were still happening. Kale's condition had not improved yet. That was the hard part of the night. The part that Edna had not promised would not happen, because she did not make promises about things she could not control. She had said the process was slow. She had said the body needed time to receive what she was giving it. She had said that the first signs of response might not come for hours. But knowing something in your head and living through it are very different things. Around the third hour of the night Kale's breathing worsened. It happened gradually and then suddenly, the way bad things often do. The breaths that had been shallow became shorter. A sound entered them, a faint tight sound like something inside was pressing against something else. His scale color, which had shown the very faintest hint of returning green in the upper chest, faded back toward gray. Riven stood up from his stool. He did not say anything. He just stood and looked at his brother with his hands at his sides and his thin wings pulled tight against his back. Edna checked the sensor readings quickly. Her face did not change dramatically but her hands moved faster, making small adjustments with focused precision. She added a careful measure of the mineral compound and shifted the thermal pad placement slightly, watching the temperature reading as she did. Soren stood up from his bench by the door. He walked closer and looked at the readings over Edna's shoulder. Then he said, in a quiet voice that was almost, but not quite, without condescension, that perhaps it was time to consider that the treatment was not working, that continuing to push could cause further stress to the organs, that sometimes the most responsible thing a healer could do was stop. Edna did not look at him. She watched the temperature reading and made another small adjustment. She said, without any particular heat in her voice, that she would keep going. Soren looked at her for a moment. Then he walked back to his bench and sat down and said nothing else. The next hour was the hardest. Riven sat back down on his stool but he was not still anymore. He leaned forward with his claws pressed together between his knees and his eyes moving between Kale's face and Edna's hands and the small display of the sensor reading that he had learned enough over the course of the night to partially understand. He watched the numbers and he watched his brother breathe and he felt the thing in his chest that had been hope becoming harder to hold. After a long stretch of silence he spoke. His voice came out quieter than he meant it to, almost too quiet, as though part of him was not sure he wanted the question answered. He asked Edna if she had ever lost someone she was trying to save. The room was very still after he said it. Even the sound of Kale's difficult breathing seemed to pause, though it did not. Edna's hands did not stop. She was in the middle of a careful adjustment and she finished it completely before she responded. She checked the reading one more time. Then she answered him in the same plain and even voice she used for everything. She said yes. More than once. And she said that every time she had still tried. Riven looked at her. He had asked the question because part of him was looking for reassurance. Part of him had wanted her to say no, that she had never lost anyone, that her record was perfect and Kale was going to be fine. That would have been a comforting thing to hear. It would also have been something he could not fully believe. What she had said instead was something he could believe completely. It landed in him differently than comfort would have. Not softer, but deeper. More solid. She had lost people and she had kept going and she was here right now still going, and that meant something that a clean perfect record could never have meant. He nodded slowly and did not say anything else. The night moved on. Around the 5th hour Edna reached the most delicate part of the treatment. She had explained it earlier in general terms. The process she called thermal threading required the mineral compounds to be guided through the body using very precise temperature variation, applied in a specific pattern across specific points. It was not something a machine could do automatically, not the machine she had. It required manual placement and manual adjustment, reading the body's response in real time and shifting the approach accordingly. It required her hands to be completely steady. Edna knew before she started that this was going to be the problem. Her hands had developed a tremor over the last several years. It was not severe. In most of the medical work she still did it was manageable, something she had learned to work around and compensate for through technique and positioning. She had adjusted her practice around it the way a person adjusts their walking when one leg is not quite what it used to be. Most days it was fine. This was not most days. Thermal threading left no room for compensation. The margin between the right placement and the wrong one was very small, and the consequence of getting it wrong was not a minor error. It was the kind of error that could push the crystals inward rather than dissolving them. The kind of error that could make things significantly worse very quickly. She positioned herself carefully beside the platform. She set her feet. She steadied her breathing. She placed her hands over the first point and began. For the first minute it was manageable. The tremor was there, but she was controlling it, pressing it down through concentration and deliberate muscle tension the way she always did. Her hands moved in the small careful patterns required, and she watched the sensor, and the patterns were close enough. Then the fatigue hit. It was not sudden. It had been building for hours, the weight of age and a full night of precise and effortful work catching up to hands that had been doing too much for too long. The tremor increased. Not dramatically, not visibly to someone across the room. But she could feel it in her fingers. She could feel the small uncontrolled shifts that were pulling her placement off by fractions. Fractions that mattered. She stopped. She took a breath. She repositioned and tried again. The tremor was still there. Slightly worse now because stopping and restarting had broken the muscle tension she had built up. She did not show what she was feeling on her face. But her jaw tightened. Riven had been watching her hands all night. He had watched them long enough to know what they looked like when they were moving exactly as she intended and what they looked like when something was different. He saw the difference now. He saw the tiny irregular movements that had not been there before. He saw her stop and restart. He saw the line of her jaw change. He did not ask. He did not say anything at all. He simply stood up from his stool, moved to the platform beside her, and very gently reached up and wrapped his small clawed hands around hers from beneath. Not gripping. Not interfering. Just holding. The way a base holds something that needs to be kept from moving. Light and steady and completely certain. Edna felt the tremor absorb into stillness. She looked down at his hands around hers for just a moment. Then she looked back at her work. Neither of them said a word about it. There was nothing to say. It was simply what needed to happen, and it was happening, and the night was still going, and Kale was still breathing, and that was what mattered. They stayed like that together in the low light of the room, the old human woman and the small dragon boy, holding steady against the longest hours of the night, while the rest of the world outside stayed quiet and dark and completely unaware of what was being held together inside that room by two pairs of hands that had no business being as steady as they were. But they were steady. And they did not stop. The first light of morning came slowly. It did not arrive the way light arrives in better places, bright and sudden and warm. In Ashmark the dawn crept in through the narrow windows and thin pale lines, gray at first, then slowly, gradually, gaining a faint orange tone as the sun climbed behind the dust in the sky. It was not beautiful light. But it was morning. And morning meant the night was over. Edna had not slept. She had not sat down either, not properly, not for more than a few minutes at a time across the entire night. She stood beside the platform where Kale lay, and she worked and she checked and she adjusted and she worked again. Her back ached in the way that backs ache when they have been asked to do too much for too long. Her eyes were dry and heavy. Her hands, which Riven had steadied through the most critical hours, had settled back into their usual slight tremor now that the threading was done, but the delicate work was finished and the tremor no longer mattered. She checked the sensor one more time. The numbers were different from what they had been 3 hours ago. Different from what they had been 6 hours ago. She looked at them carefully and checked them against the reading she had taken at the start, running the comparison slowly in her tired mind to make sure she was reading correctly and not seeing what she wanted to see because she was exhausted. She was reading correctly. The crystal density in Kale's secondary organs had dropped. Not slightly. Significantly. The mineral compounds had done what she had believed they would do, weakening the crystalline structures from within, and the thermal threading had guided that process through the areas where the spread had been most advanced. The ash veil was not gone yet. But it was retreating. The spread had reversed. The body was beginning to clear what remained. Edna let out a slow breath and set the sensor down on the edge of the platform. She did not celebrate. She did not turn around and announce what she had found. She simply stood for a moment with her hand resting lightly on the edge of the stone platform and let the quiet fact of it settle. Riven had fallen asleep on his stool somewhere around the 6th hour. He had fought it for a long time, blinking hard and sitting straight and refusing to let his eyes close. But the body does what the body must do eventually, and exhaustion had finally pulled him under. He was slumped forward with his arms folded on the edge of the platform and his head resting on them, his thin wings loose and low, his breathing slow and even. Drazen had not slept. He was still in his chair against the far wall. He had not moved much across the whole night. He sat in the same position he had settled into hours ago, his great arms on his knees, his amber eyes open. He had watched Edna work all night in complete silence. Whatever he had been thinking during those hours he had kept entirely to himself. Soren was awake. He had dozed briefly on his bench near the door but was sitting up now, his equipment on his knees, his pale Vethkan eyes watching the platform with an expression that had been changing slowly all night and had arrived, by morning, at something that was almost but not quite readable. The room was quiet. And then Kale moved. It was small at first. A shift of the claws. A slight turn of the head, slow and uncertain, the movement of someone coming back from somewhere very far away. Then his chest expanded with a breath that was deeper than any breath he had taken all night, a real breath, a full one, the kind that moves the whole body. Riven's eyes opened. He lifted his head from his arms and looked at his brother and went completely still, the way a person goes still when they are afraid that if they move or speak they will break something that is only just beginning. Kale's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first. He stared at the ceiling of the room without recognition, blinking slowly in the thin morning light coming through the windows. His scales in the pale dawn were showing color. Not full color, not the deep rich green of his healthy self, but the gray was receding. A warmth was returning to them, moving slowly across his scales the way color returns to cold skin when it begins to warm. He was alive. Not barely alive. Not surviving in the fragile, desperate way he had been surviving all night. He was breathing steadily and his eyes were open and the color was coming back and he was alive in a way that was real and growing more real by the second. Riven made a sound that was not a word. He stood up so quickly the stool scraped back across the stone floor and he reached out and put his small clawed hand on his brother's arm and said his name. Kale turned his head slowly toward the sound. His eyes found Riven's face and stayed there. He did not speak yet. But something in his expression shifted, the confusion softening into something else, something that recognized and held on. The room had been quiet. Now it was a different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when a large number of beings are all experiencing the same thing at the same moment and none of them have found words for it yet. Soren stood up from his bench. He crossed to the platform with his equipment and began examining Kale in the methodical and thorough way that was his professional habit. He ran his instruments over Kale's chest and sides and back. He checked the readings. He checked them again. He adjusted the calibration on his equipment and checked them a third time. He stood back. He looked at his readings. He looked at Kale. He looked at his readings again. The ashvale crystals were gone. Not reduced. Not slowed. Not partially dissolved. Gone. The organs that had been 30% crystallized when he had made his diagnosis in the marketplace were clear. The tissue was intact. The spread that had been accelerating under treatment all day had not just stopped. It had reversed completely and resolved entirely. In all of Soren's years of medical practice, across his training and his career and every case he had read about in Vethkan medical records, ashvale sickness in the advanced stage had never resolved. It had never been recorded as reversible once it reached the secondary organs. The outcome was always the same. It had always been the same. Until this morning. Soren stood very still beside the platform for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at Edna. Edna was standing a short distance from the platform. She had picked up her kit and was beginning, quietly and without performance, to repack her instruments. Her movements were slow with tiredness but they were organized. She was not looking at Soren. She was not looking at the room. She was putting her things in order the way she always did when a job was finished. Soren opened his mouth. He closed it again. He looked back at his readings one more time as though they might have changed. They had not. He did not say anything. There was nothing in his training or his experience or his considerable professional vocabulary that covered this particular moment adequately and he was self-aware enough to know it. The dragon elders who had returned to the room in the early morning hours stood along the walls in complete silence. One of them had their hand raised slightly, a gesture in dragon culture that indicated something witnessed that cannot be explained. Several of them exchanged looks but no one spoke. Drazen had stood up from his chair. He had stood when Kale's eyes opened and he had remained standing while Soren ran his examination and reached his wordless conclusion. He stood now in the middle of the room, the largest figure there, the oldest and the most proud, and he looked at Kale breathing steadily on the platform and then he looked at Edna. He crossed the room slowly. Every eye followed him. His footsteps were heavy and even on the stone floor. He walked the full length of the room without hurrying and without looking anywhere except at the old human woman who was quietly repacking a battered medical kit with tired hands. Edna looked up when he stopped in front of her. Drazen was enormous up close. He had always been enormous. He filled the space in front of her the way a wall fills a doorway. His old scarred scales and his amber eyes and the weight of everything he was and everything he represented in this colony and in his family stood in front of her in the thin morning light. He lowered his head. Not a small nod. Not a slight incline. A full bow, slow and deliberate, the great head coming down to a level that dragons reserved for those they considered genuinely worthy of genuine respect. It was not a gesture Drazen made easily or often. Everyone in the room knew that. When he raised his head again, his voice came out low and rough, as though the words had some difficulty getting through, as though they had to push past something that had been in their way for a long time. He said, "I was wrong about you." Edna looked at him steadily. Her face was tired and plain and honest. She did not smile widely or stand straighter or let satisfaction show in any dramatic way. She gave him a single nod. Then she looked back down at her kit and continued packing her instruments away, one by one, carefully and without rushing. Across the room, Ryvan was holding his brother's hand with both of his small claws. Kale's fingers had curled weakly around them. Neither brother was speaking. They did not need to. The morning light through the narrow windows was getting slowly brighter. The morning after Kale opened his eyes, Ashmark woke up to a story it did not fully believe. Word had been moving through the colony since before dawn, passed from person to person the way news moves in small places, quietly and quickly and with each retelling slightly larger than the last. By the time the marketplace opened and the traders set up their stalls and the ordinary business of the day began, almost everyone in Ashmark had heard some version of what had happened in Drazen's stone building during the night. A retired human medic had cured Ashvale's sickness. Advanced stage. Secondary organs already affected. Declared unsolvable by the colony's own medical team. Cured overnight using basic equipment and old compounds and methods that the Vethkan healers had never seen applied that way before. Most people heard it and said they would believe it when they saw it. Then they saw Kale sitting up. It was 2 days after the night of the treatment. He was not strong yet. He was nowhere near full strength and everyone who knew dragons knew it would be weeks before he was properly himself again. But he was sitting up on the platform with color in his scales and focus in his eyes and a cup of something warm in his clawed hands, and that was so far beyond what anyone had expected that simply seeing it settled the question for most of the colony without another word needing to be said. The story spread outward from Ashmark the way stories do when they are extraordinary enough. Traders carried it to the next colony along the supply route. From there it moved to a transit station where ships from 4 different directions passed through regularly. Within a week it had reached places that had never heard of Ashmark at all, places where the name meant nothing but the story meant something, because Ashvale's sickness was known throughout this part of space and its reputation was consistent and grim everywhere it was known. The name Edna traveled with the story. Not loudly. Not attached to any title or ceremony. Just a name, an old human medic, retired, living quietly at the edge of things, who had done what the best healers available had said was impossible. In Ashmark itself, the changes were quieter but more real. Drazen did not make a speech. He was not the kind of dragon who made speeches about things he would rather have handled differently from the beginning. But he spoke to the elders privately and whatever he said resulted in a formal acknowledgement, delivered simply and publicly in the colony square, that Edna held a place of standing in Ashmark. Not a position. Not a role. Simply a recognition that she belonged there and was owed the respect that belonging carried. Edna received the acknowledgement the way she received most things. Without performance and without excessive comment. She nodded and went home and made tea and went to bed early because she was still tired from a night that had asked a great deal of her. The Vethkan healers at the medical post were quieter than usual for several days. They went about their work and treated their patients and said little about what had happened. Soren in particular said nothing publicly. He was a proud being in the way that people who have built their identity around their expertise tend to be proud, and what had happened was not easy for that kind of pride to process quickly. On the 4th day after Kale woke up, Soren came to Edna's door alone. He did not send a message ahead. He did not bring his assistants or his equipment or any of the professional trappings that usually accompanied him. He came in plain clothes without his medical insignia, and he knocked on the door himself and waited. Edna opened it and looked at him. He stood straight in the way he always stood, but there was something different in his expression. The careful professional composure was still there, but underneath it something had shifted, and what had shifted was the thing that had made him dismiss her from the beginning, the absolute settled certainty that he already knew the most important things and that a human woman with an old kit could not possibly show him anything he needed to see. That certainty was gone. He told her, without preamble and without making it longer than it needed to be, that he wanted to learn what she had done. The mineral flushing. The thermal threading. The specific sequencing and the reasoning behind each step. He wanted to understand it properly, not just observe it but understand it well enough to use it and to teach it to others. He said, and this part was quieter than the rest, that Ashvale's sickness had taken patients from him before. More than one. Patients he had been unable to help. And if there was a method that worked, then he needed to know it, regardless of where it came from or who was teaching it. Edna looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the door wider and told him to come in and sit down. She taught him across several sessions over the following days. She was a clear and patient teacher, the kind who explains the reasoning behind each step rather than just the steps themselves, because she had always believed that understanding why something works is more important than memorizing what to do. Soren was a good student when his ego was not in the way, and with the ego set aside he was actually very good, asking precise questions and catching details quickly. By the end of it something had changed between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, they were too different and had started too badly for warmth to arrive quickly. But something honest. A professional respect that was real because it had been earned on both sides and neither of them was pretending it was more than it was. Cale's recovery continued steadily. By the end of the first week he was walking short distances. By the end of the second he was spending time outside in the colony air, sitting in the places where the low evening light came between the buildings in long warm lines. He tired easily and he knew it, and for once in his life he did not fight it, which told everyone who knew him how seriously the illness had taken him and how seriously he was taking the recovery. Riven was with him almost every day. He had gone back to his ordinary life in the colony, or what passed for ordinary, but ordinary looked slightly different now than it had before. The young dragons who had called him Hollow Bones and Ashwing still existed. The looks were still sometimes there. But Riven moved through it differently. Not louder, not more aggressive, not performing any kind of new confidence that had not existed before. Just steadier. As though something inside him had been set more firmly in place and was not moving easily anymore. One evening they sat together outside on a low flat stone near the eastern edge of the colony where the buildings opened up enough to see a wide stretch of the sky. The stars were coming out, thin and scattered in the orange dark above Ashmark. Cale had a covering around his shoulders because he still felt the cold more than usual. Riven sat beside him with his knees pulled up and his thin wings loose at his back. They had been sitting quietly for a while when Cale spoke. He did not look at Riven when he started. He looked at the sky the way people look at something wide and open when they are trying to say something that matters and want the space around the words to be large enough to hold them properly. He said that he had been thinking, across all the days of his recovery, about what had actually happened. Not the medical part of it. The other part. He said he had been thinking about Riven running through the colony when every door closed in his face and running again and not stopping. He said he had been thinking about Riven standing between Edna and Drazen in that room with nothing in his hands except the truth and his refusal to move. He said that people had called Riven weak his whole life. He said he had defended Riven against that word more times than he could count. But he said that before that night he had not fully understood what the word strong actually meant. He thought he had. He had been wrong. He turned and looked at his little brother directly. He told Riven plainly that asking for help when everyone around you says no, running toward the one person left when every other door has closed, standing in front of someone 10 times your size with nothing but the truth and refusing to move, that was not weakness. That was not even close to weakness. That took more courage than any show of strength he had ever seen or performed in his own life. He said that Riven had saved him. Not Edna alone. Riven. Because without Riven there was no Edna, and without Edna there was no morning, and without that morning there was nothing after it. Riven did not answer for a long time. The stars came out further above them and the colony lights came on one by one across the settlement and the evening air moved cool and quiet between the buildings. Then Riven sat a little straighter. It was a small movement. His spine settling differently, his thin wings shifting slightly back rather than pressing flat. It was not dramatic and it was not performed, and it lasted because it came from somewhere real. Edna was walking home from the colony supply post on the far side of the settlement when she passed the open stretch near the eastern edge and saw them sitting there. 2 dragons on a flat stone in the evening light, the large one with a covering on his shoulders and the small one beside him with his knees up. She recognized Riven by his wings. The thin uneven wings that caught the last of the fading light at their edges and held it there for a moment, turning it gold. She did not call out to them. She did not interrupt something that was complete without her. She walked on toward home, her kit under her arm and her steps slow and easy, and she thought about a small dragon boy grabbing her sleeve with both clawed hands outside her dwelling in the middle of a desperate afternoon, and the look in his eyes when she had stood up and picked up her kit and said, "Take me to him." She had saved Cale that night. She knew that, and she was glad of it in the plain and quiet way she was glad of most things. But the boy who had refused to stop running had done something that night too. Something that no medical kit and no amount of experience and no thermal threading technique could have done alone. He had refused to let his brother go. And that, Edna thought as she opened her door and set her kit down and put the kettle on, was the part of the story that mattered most. Not the cure. Not the impossible thing that the healers could not explain. The small dragon boy who ran when everyone told him to stop. That was the part worth remembering.